So the first thing that I want to talk about today was a point that Rebecca brought up yesterday, or the last course that we were here, and I didn't realize until a little bit later about what she was saying. And the issue that she thought was should be brought up, which I agree, is that at some points it seemed like I was inferring that there is a very clear distinction, or that there is a very clear Jewish worldview in this moment that's contradicting Paul's view. Now, I'm sure that most of you realize that when we sort of say these things, we're grasping at straws and trying to define historical realities that are much more complex than the terms we have to define them. So I assumed that, but I do want to be clear that some elements of Judaism during this period did accept the idea that there were, negative actors in terms of cosmology. This was the origin of a lot of demonic interest since the Babylonian transition. But there was always, I would also carefully say that even people who had the two theories of heaven idea tended to be much more nuanced about it than a lot of the Christian developments would take place, especially with Paul. And I guess that was truly what I wanted to say. So just to underscore that, is that although when people were dealing with similar ideas and similar concepts and similar situations, oftentimes the predominant religious narrative will anchor that slightly, which I think is important to remember. So even though Paul is interested in negative actors, negative spiritual actors, there are many Jewish thinkers who likewise were, but they often had a different idea in origination, etc. So I wanted to be clear about that, and I think that she was very good about bringing that out. Um, Now, I think that to start also with this, I think that we should start today with a review of why it is important to recognize the use of divination and pagan philosophy in Paul. And secondly, what does recognizing this set of practices help us with understanding Paul's background in the intellectual atmosphere of Western Asia during the first century? Uh, I want to removing Paul from the intellectual traditions of Jewish pietistic legalism, which is what I'm referring to as Phariseeism. Again, on that intent that I'm trying to be very specific that we are not dealing with the Pharisees as that they were later conceived, but with a variety of different groups expounding similar ideas, mostly a heightened attention to legalistic following and to the belief in some form of an external or oral Torah, oral law that undergirds the written law in the Hebrew scriptures. So that's what I'm referring to. Does not imply that he was without an intellectual context, just a different one from that which his followers established for him. And as I argue, the content of this intellectual background came from, in my opinion, the Western Asian apocalyptic tradition and in his Hellenistic background. And for those of you who'd like to know more about that, I encourage you to watch the Paul amongst the Gentiles, the strategies for rhetorical strategies, because that clarifies a lot of this. Um, and yeah, and I would say to any of you, if you're having any issues, thinking through our series so far, just go back and review some of those videos, and I think it'll be well worth your time. It is mine. I go back, and that's why I always start by trying to rephrase whatever I messed up the week before. So it's very useful. Um, so okay, so we've gotten that, and I want to say that so let's take a look at the primary source for this week, and I've included some readings for the week as well as a follow-up email. I'll send them to you afterwards, but these are the specific texts that I cited here that I think that you may be interested in looking over at your own time. And after hearing the lecture, my hope is that the readings which I send will make more sense and add to the discussion. They may make less, but that's not my intention. And that tonight's lecture is not primarily drawn from my own research, but from the work of Matthew Sharp, who is at the University of Edinburgh. And in my opinion, I think he's one of the rising stars of Pauline studies. And I actually have invited him to speak for the library, so I think he will. We're trying to work that that time out. Um, but this will be, as I've said, the last lecture that we are going to be talking about Paul and the ancient world. We are going to jump almost 900 years into the future and go right to the heart of the Reformation, which is a new valence on Paul. And I did this because, this has to end somewhere, as they say. And if we would have gone through Paul in the Middle Ages, that's an entirely different kettle of fish. And I really think that, there's at some other point we'll probably discuss that. Paul, mostly within the context of the medieval church. But that's a really fascinating period in and of itself, but it requires a sort of different valence than what I've been using. And it's not my favorite material. There's a lot of very specific, quirky things about it, but it is interesting. It's very important, but sometimes it's a little dense to get through. So here is a picture of the book, and it's available from the library. And if you're interested in purchasing it, you can buy it from University of Edinburgh Press. It came out in 2024, so it is very new. And I think that we are at the top of the pile at SLC in covering it. And I would like, by way of introduction into this topic of this evening, to quote from him. So, and this D&P, by the way, when you see this throughout, this is referencing Divination and Philosophy in Paul, which is the name of the book. So he starts with this quotation from Xenophon. What is hidden from mortals, we should try to find out from the gods by divination, for to him that is in their grace the gods grant a sign. Throughout his letters, Paul claims to convey the words and the will of his God, and that God's Messiah Jesus. This observation is painfully obvious, but has not generally received the attention it deserves in Pauline scholarship. For those studying his letters from a confessional perspective, such an observation may be taken for granted or treated at the level of general inspiration of Scripture. For many lay readers of Paul, the passages that need more explanation are those in which he claims not to be speaking directly for God, such as in 1 Corinthians 7:12. For critical scholarship, the truth value of such claims is appropriately bracketed, and attention instead focuses on the development of his ideas within his cultural and religious milieu. I think we've done a lot of that here. Within this cultural and religious milieu, though we may still ask the question, if Paul claims to convey the words and will of a deity, how does he believe he has received such knowledge? Very good question. And I think he's absolutely right that very few people have really wrestled with that before. How does he come to these conclusions? His letters suggest a variety of means through which he discerns the divine will. He has visions and revelations of the risen Jesus. He receives prophetic words and wisdom transmitted by holy pneuma, which we will talk about, and he interprets Jewish sacred text and more generally the road signs of divine activity in the human and the natural world around him. Now, to draw our attention to the answer that Sharp gives in his own question, I would like to highlight the latter phrasing in this section and the way that Sharp says Paul has intuited his insights. So, to rephrase, his letters suggest a variety of means through which he discerns the divine will. He has visions and revelations of the risen Jesus. He receives prophetic words and wisdom transmitted by holy pneuma. He interprets Jewish sacred text, and more generally, he reads signs of divine activity in the human and natural world around him. So, although it is very basic, it is not easy to understand how he makes one jump to the other. And Sharp does a very good job, in my opinion, of showing exactly how that works out, which he's relating to divinatory discourse. Sharp suggests that these three operations, vision, transmission by the holy pneuma, a very complicated term, which according to the Stoics, it was, and this is my quotation about pneuma, so listen up for those of you who find that to be problematic. This comes from Paul Robertson's assessment. A vital physiological and cosmological substance that was active in varying amounts in all areas of the cosmos and which could be used to intuit the will of gods and future events. Now that's what pneuma means. And we're going to learn very, very quickly that that phrase. Now, there's also a secondary non-spiritual interpretation of that, which is equally important, but it's an earlier one, and really we can't spend that much time. The very important point to remember is that at one time, this sort of physiological thoughts of ancient Greece become spiritualized and activated in this context in the first century world to mean something perhaps different than what the original Stoics meant, and certainly more expanded than what they would have said. And we'll talk about that as well because it relates to the issue of correspondence. Very important for Swedenborgianism. So, again, a vital physiological and cosmological substance that was active in various amounts and conveyed information not otherwise accessible. And three, we have his interpretation of Jewish sacred text. And four, very important, and I think the one that's most commonly familiar, he reads signs of divine activity in the human and natural world around him. And though I agree, obviously, with each of these points, I would actually add a fifth category. Paul theosophizes his own polemical arguments. And by that I mean he comes to rational conclusions and he elevates those rational conclusions to the level of divine discourse. Though Sharp is interested in presenting the relationship that Paul shared with divinatory practice and theories of the ancient world, the relationship between logogetic discourse, meaning that which is derived from philosophy, and discourse and prophecy or myth, was solidified in that period. So I think that that's a key point as well, and that the Paul at several times, and there is a long history which we'll talk about very directly, about people saying that revelation and philosophy are much closer than you can understand, and using your mind to come, going through logos and coming to logogistic rational arguments was a type of divination itself. It's a very, very interesting point. So, though Sharp is interested in presenting the relationships that Paul shared with divinatory practice and the theory of divination in the ancient world, the relationships between logogetic discourse and prophecy or myth is not something that he discussed, but was something that was solidified during the period he's speaking to. And particularly when it comes to the issue of daemons. Daemons are very important in the ancient world for conveying information. And I suspect that he's going to cover what he didn't in this book. He has a forthcoming article which is called Courting Daemons in Corinth, Demonic Partnerships in Cosmic Hierarchies, as well as Divine Jealousy in Paul. And it's coming in an edited volume on demonology by Hector Patmore and Joseph Lösel for Brill's it's Ancient Judaism and Christianity series. And I think that will be where he does more of this, and we can do a separate study on that if you'd like to. I'll see what it looks like when it comes out. But as I will spend most of the rest of this time that we have together discussing Sharp's argument, and I believe he assumes that at least a little bit of the readers that are reading his arguments will also share this background. I think he does assume that. I want to make my point, my little contribution. I want to put that a little bit in front from what he says, because I think we can actually use it to work back through some of the other points that he makes. And I want to make some of these backgrounds very clear for those of you who are not so interested not so familiar with some of these ideas. So, I also want to say that we will be looking at Paul's use of divination in the context of revelation, logoistic argumentation, and finally the idea of that inherent in the natural world there are hidden signs of the Lord and his will. Though it is not far from Swedenborg's own notion of correspondence, there is a legacy of connection here that we will explore in greater detail when we look at Swedenborg's engagement with Paul. Because I think a lot of the way that Swedenborg is formulating the theory of correspondence actually comes from what's in embryo in some of Paul's own writings. So let's go first to the Platonists and the Stoics. So both of these groups treated reasoned inquiry as an unveiling of cosmic truth once hidden in poetic legend. By the mid-Hellenistic age, philosophical proofs themselves were seen as messages delivered by the divine intellect. By the Hellenistic era, this fusion of reason and revelation laid the groundwork for a tradition in which the philosophical insights themselves were regarded as a kind of prophetic message from the intelligible realm. Middle Platonists, like Numinus of Apamea, treated logical distinctions about the one and the intellect as celestial utterances. Plutarch spoke of reading philosophical arguments as if he were interpreting sacred text. And Apuleius of Maduros wove Platonic dialectic together with Chaldean oracles. He presented Platonic proofs as a type of divine scripture, believing daimons, these spirits, channeled these revelations. They read philosophical arguments as if interpreting divine scriptures, believing that logical distinctions about the one and the intellect were transcriptions of these utterances brought forth through daimones. And Paul elevates his own letters to a comparable status, commanding obedience. If anyone does not recognize this as the Lord's command, he writes in 1 Corinthians 14:37 through 38. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is what I meant to say. Yeah, sorry, I was on the wrong slide. If anyone does not recognize this as the Lord's command, he is not to be recognized. He says that there. So Plotinus is also a very interesting person. So he recasts rational demonstration into a spiritual ladder or a spiritual layers of significance. His apophatic theology, and apophasis means, describing the one by what it is not. It's very popular in the Eastern Church. Used careful argumentation not only as a rhetorical tool, but also as a type of meditation. Plotinus's apophatic theology uses negation to point beyond concepts to the ineffable one. Paul similarly contrasts human reasoning with a hidden wisdom that only the Spirit can reveal. He proclaims Christ crucified as foolishness to the Greeks, but to us the power of God and the wisdom of God. A mystery impervious to worldly rulers and accessible only through divine revelation. Each syllogism about emanation of the soul became an occasion for inner illumination, a revelation of the ineffable beyond sensory experience. Through rigorous dialectic arguments, he traced the emanation of the divine intellect and soul, inviting his practitioners to meditate on these structures as transformative, revelatory visions. His Eneids, written between the year 204 and 270, present reasoned proofs as milestones in an inner ascent toward direct, ecstatic union with the transcendent One. Paul likewise insists that his gospel is not rooted in human persuasion, but in a direct and divine encounter. He stresses again and again that his message came not through human agency, and you guys are probably tired of hearing this particular one, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ, and that he received it in visions, being caught up to the third heaven, which grounded his apostolic authority. Proclus elevated syllogisms to liturgical rites. He taught that engaging deeply with Platonic proofs activated the soul's potential. Logical premises thus functioned like sacramental signs, transforming discourse into a living oracle from the intelligible realm. In parallel, Paul presents the reading of his epistles and the celebration of the Lord's Supper as liturgical acts that disclose heavenly mysteries. His Eucharistic formula, "This is my body, this is the cup of the new covenant," renders the gospel itself into a sacred rite, while he commends his letters as vehicles of the mystery made known by revelation to the saints. He says this in Ephesians chapter 3, 3 through 5. Each of these elements shows the extensive Hellenic influence on Paul and his understanding of his own apostleship. But as Sharp's book clearly shows, there are also many additional elements that curated his access to the divine. The most pivotal being the first one we will discuss, following Sharp's outline, is his experience of vision. Heidi Wendt referred to Paul as a freelance religious expert. And and as with other groups, he was an itinerant religious actor, like mystikoi, the initiators, preachers, and the peripatetic exorcist of the first century Roman world. And I still agree that this is the best context in which to understand the nature of Paul's thought. As Sharp writes on the 29th page of his book, the mixture of philosophical doctrines and practical religious ends evidently proved attractive to a number of Jewish intellectuals of the first century. Philo of Alexandria, most famously, has his own brand of Stoicized Platonism, which he traces from Moses via Pythagoras. But other texts, such as the Wisdom of Solomon and Fourth Maccabees, do not openly claim Plato or any other Greek philosopher as a source, but betray the same intellectual milieu as they merge biblical exegesis with their own distinctive blends of Stoic and Platonic cosmologies and physics. Paul fits in this context, not as a professional philosopher, but as one like other figures of his day, who could make creative and flexible use of these intellectual currents for his own practical ends. As will be seen, Paul's statements about the mechanics of divination are all comprehensible within these broader philosophical discourses in Greco-Roman antiquity, even as he treats some familiar concepts in distinctive ways and turns them toward his own ends. As Sharp shows, there were several ostensibly pagan categories which Paul uses to convey the reality of his own spiritual experiences. And Shaw quotes as a way of introduction Cicero's On Divination, where the Latin author paraphrases Posidonius, who was a Stoic philosopher, on the way that one might interpret the will of the gods. First, the soul is clairvoyant of itself because of its kinship with the gods. Second, the air is full of immortal souls, already clearly stamped, as it were, with the marks of truth. And third, the gods in person converse with men when they are asleep. This was a highly competitive industry. This was a highly competitive industry, and direct experience then as now was a surefire way to increase one's credibility in spiritual insight. Indeed, it was the central claim of Paul's ministry and authority that he had seen the resurrected, and he uses the word pneumatic, which is why I spent that time earlier talking about pneumasis, Christ, as this well familiar to all of you now quote from 1 Corinthians shows. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Now, as I mentioned that we are talking about pneuma, I want to also bring out that this concept, which has a very long history in Stoic ideas, is directly used by Paul when he is discussing the resurrection of the Lord, as he says in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, verses 42 through 49. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man Adam became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of the heaven. A very unique phrasing there. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man of heaven. Now, right here is the koine for this particular verse, and in red is the use of pneumatikoi and pneumatikos or pneumatikon, something pertaining to the elements of the gods. And it's really, really interesting here because he's saying that is ultimately what we are doing, in following Jesus and in embracing the Jewish tradition. You are, in the Jesus movement, to accept Jesus as messiahship is the dispensation of the pneumatic quality upon the individual. However, far from simply seeing the resurrected Jesus, Paul uses this encounter with Jesus as the beginning of a new paradigm of reality, and he expressly uses the language of Stoic Platonic cosmology to intimate this, as well as to solidify his own apostolic authority. Paul's vision also bestowed on him the title and commission of an apostle. This connection always comes with a fair amount of rhetorical backpedaling in the Corinthian correspondence. In 1 Corinthians 9:1, Paul mentions the vision of Jesus and his apostolic status in the same breath, but only for the sake of enlisting the theoretical privileges of this role that he willingly foregoes. And that's a quote from Sharp, Sharp, and that's from 74. I didn't put it in quotation marks, so I didn't realize. So Paul's vision of the appearance of the pneumatic Christ, which in Greek this phrase is epiphanos or epiphany, same word in English, causes him to become an itinerant proponent of the gospel of Christ. And in this way, he is following in the footsteps of a much larger Hellenic tradition of popular religion. Shaw contrasts Paul's transformation with Jesus, transformation by seeing Jesus, with another epiphaneic appearance, in that case that of the first century father Epicrates, establishing a shrine for his deceased son Diophantos. So this is the ancient Greek here, and the translation: I want my inheritors and successors after me to know that all these things have been set apart and devoted and consecrated together to the funerary monument to hero Diophantos, and that I was impelled to set apart for him what was previously written, not only for the purpose of the love of my child, but also by dreams, signs, and apparitions of the hero himself, visiting me visibly and repeatedly to set apart for him a portion, meaning a shrine. So we see that this is not at all uncommon, that already in the Hellenic world, we are seeing people who are having experiences, and these are calling them either to an peripatetic life, meaning a wandering life, or to some kind of heightened level of religious devotion. And Paul uses these same sorts of common knowledge to establish his own record. And in short, if there is one central concept that I would like to draw from Sharp's work, it is that there are several comparable situations in which the visionary element of the spiritual encounter is centered as the cause genera for a dramatic spiritual change, and it draws from Greek notions of epiphany and the entire genre of cosmic ascents, which were bread and butter in the ancient Greek world. However, what makes Paul so interesting is the long-standing authority which his texts his texts uniquely have dominated. With that, we end that question, which I should go continuously. Why is this? It's been a central concern of the seminar, but we are leaving that. So with that, we can no longer speak about the visionary encounter, but we have to talk about the revelation inherent in the natural world and through the actions of men. The ancient world, and as well people today, have sought supernatural information through a plethora of different mediums, as this slide shows. And I got some of this from Victoria. She sent me one of her stuff. So we have aeromancy, by watching atmospheric phenomena; bibliomancy, divination from books; geomancy, divination by interpreting markets; scapulmancy. We have all of these things. This is a very common, you've got all of these different divinatory forms. And so these also were absolutely as important during his time, and even more so. So he would have been familiar with all of these. They were part of daily life. And yes, so as one of the earliest concepts to undergird the notion of correspondence, this is my sort of, I forgot to put a introduction here. So we're talking about all of these points here have one thing in common, that they are constructing from looking at very specific items, effects, realities in the living world. You can understand, comprehend, and view what's going on in the supra-celestial worlds. That one is a necessary link to another. And this idea, which I mean, divination is very, very old, of course. It's one of the oldest human activities. But the interesting thing is that it was in the Stoic period that they really tried to justify through philosophy these connections. And it's that point that I think supports Swedenborg's notion of correspondence, and something that we should really look into. And one of the earliest concepts to undergird the notion of correspondence came, in my opinion, from this ancient Stoic school. Stoic cosmology sowed the seeds of what later esoteric thinkers, such as Emanuel Swedenborg, would term correspondences. And we have these individuals. All of these are mostly from the Stoic or pseudo-Stoic traditions. And this is the sort of psychological rationality that as philosophical rationality I'd like to talk about. So first we have Zeno of Citium. He introduced the doctrine of the Logos as a unifying divine reason pervading all. Then we have Cleanthes, who had elaborated the notion of zotikos pyr, or this a vital fire that was the heart of every single element. Chrysippus had developed the theory of sympatheia, which by understanding the physical world, you could link disparate elements through their pneumatic bonds, or you could understand their connections to the greater world. And these doctrines maintained that by studying the four classical elements and the world as we have it, one could discern, therefore, the mind of God. And since each manifestation reflected facets of the divine intellect, that were also relevant to human beings. So we are smaller images, the microcosm, macrocosm idea, that our thoughts are lesser degrees of what the gods think. Stoics had identified Zeus, the father of the deities, the main deity in the Greek pantheon, with the cosmic fire, this element that transcended everything, affirming that the universe was his soma, his body, and that every part bore traces of the divine presence as well as the imprint of its maker. And Marcus Aurelius had applied these ideas in moral essays, suggesting that ethical virtue required harmony with cosmic reason. And such an interconnected, animated cosmos had provided the metaphysical blueprint for later esoteric correspondence theory, such as that used by Swedenborg. By tracing the unity of all things to the logos, the reason, the underlying rationality of all things, Stoic cosmology directly inspired the concept that earthly counterparts mirrored celestial realities. And let's just go over some of these right here that we have in translation. Zeno on the spermatic logos. So he says, Zeno of Citium says that the seminal logos is the father of all substance. So everything arises from the divine. Chrysippus on Zeus as the world body talks about the cosmos as was the body of God, and his mind is its pneuma, its fundamental connections. We have also in Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus, Zeus, Father, you are the great nature of all that is, for you alone first conceive and then bring everything into being. And then we have Epictetus And what does Zeus say? And I think this is very, very interesting and to reflect this sort of microcosm, macrocosm connection, because Epictetus says, what does Zeus say? He says, if you want any good thing, get it from yourself. Meaning that the goodness is already within you, you have to manifest it as well as the bad and all other things. So look not outside, look within. The Stoic uses sources from the archaic period, especially from Homer, and came to understand that from one section of the world, further intuitive wisdom can be found. In particular, they were fond of using Homeric works as proof of this ability, two of which Cicero includes in his De Divinatoria. Cicero's on divination. Halitherses, the Ithacan seer, is one of these. So an eagle, this is an example that I think is important. So an eagle wheeled down a silver plume shaft of prey held in its talons, and 3 times it wheeled to the right. Then both seers once cried out in joy. Why did they cry out in joy? Because they Halitherses correctly prophesied deaths for the suitors, for the people that were invading. And that was one example from the ancient world of how people got information like this. The second one comes from Calchas, the Argan seer. And just so the snake had slipped from the altar's shadow, devouring sparrow, young and mother alike. So he spoke, and from our knees we rose. Then first did we know the sorrow Apollo would send. And he read that particular statement, the eating of the mother and the chick, as a forecast of 9 years of war, but with victory on the 10th. Sharp also makes a significant argument that Paul is influenced by these traditions of microcosmic, macrocosmic divination and uses them in conveying and divining God's will. Though much of this will make sense to us as a sort of given, what is important is to realize that these concepts are not as intuitive as they seem, but they are a result of significant cultural indoctrination, which blinds us to understanding the really unique way that these claims are presented. And with that precursor, I want you to look with new eyes at the use of revelation, politics, and divination throughout Paul's writings, and from the way that he's using this from the Hebrew tradition. So Sharp defines a sign in the classic sense of something which means something else. All cosmic activities formed a basis for inferring divine activity, and primarily conveying the divine approval or disapproval. Throughout the ancient Greco-Roman world, practitioners scrutinized bird flight, and this is all quotes from him, by the way, examined animal intra or derived from him, and read myriad natural phenomena for portents, treating each occurrence as a direct indicator of divine favor or admonition. This approach did not seek arcane symbolism, but emphasized straightforward indexes of divine will familiar to all sectors of society. Paul's methodology seamlessly aligned with these traditions, interpreting events as evidence of God's purposeful intervention in human affairs. Firstly, the fact that human society is often susceptible to political dangers, such as war and exile, and that these negative events have often been construed as proof of God's divine judgment, as we see here with this quote. The Babylonian exile of 597 was portrayed by the prophet Isaiah as evidence of God's disfavor. He said, Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your ancestors have stored up until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your sons who are born to you shall be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palaces of the king of Babylon. Following a similar logic, Sharp points out that Paul's use of the language of political suffering as a proof of divine disfavor is also shown in 1 Thessalonians 2:14 and 16, where Paul compares political upheavals And it's not entirely clear which upheavals he's referring to. There is, of course, the chance that there is the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. A lot of people think that this is sort of added in after that had already happened. But if you want to take it as granted that he would have written these himself and there wouldn't have been additions, you could talk about perhaps Agrippa the First reign, which is 41 through 44 CE, and the procuratorship of Venditus Cumanus, which was also a very, very difficult time for a lot of Judean Jews and for various other people. So he compares these sorts of things to the Jewish followers of the Jesus movement who were hesitant to accept his Gentile mission or his mission to the Gentiles. He connects all of these things that are going on in the church with that particular hesitancy that the Jewish Christians did not accept the Gentile Christians and his authority. And he writes, again, quote is from, let's see, 1 Thessalonians 2:14 and 16. For you, brothers and sisters, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you suffered and the same things from your own compatriots as they did from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. They displease God and oppose everyone, by hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved. Thus they have constantly been filling up the measure of their sins, but wrath has overtaken them at last. Sharper interprets this action, and I will quote from here. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul also discerns the presence of divine wrath against certain Judeans who opposed his message to the Gentiles. Paul adds to this opposition the charge of killing the Lord Jesus and the prophets, so that they are continually filling up the measure of their sins, but the wrath has come upon them, leading toward its completion. Here again is the notion that immediate historical signs of wrath form part of a trajectory leading towards a full and final judgment. While the Corinthians are told to heed these signs of judgment and recognize them as acts of divine discipline, the Judeans who continue to oppose Paul's message continue to fill up their measure of sins, so that the approximate sign of the judgment continue to point towards their final completion. And this is where Sharp discusses whether the claim that these are looking back and not looking forward, the claim that these were written after the destruction in 70 CE. So reading this text with post-70 CE eyes has led many to believe the text must be a post-Pauline interpolation that refers to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple as the final act of God's wrath on the Jews. Burning temples were certainly bad omens, signaling the lack of divine presence and precisely the place where it should be normally. But to assume that this was the only event of the first century that could elicit such language from Paul underestimates the range of events that could be attributed to divine anger. It also, as many has pointed out, assumes the hindsight that would have been unavailable if the text is truly from Paul. And that comes from 176 to 177 of his book. The second sign of God's wrath for Paul deals with his perception of the moral sign, or what was used in the book of Romans, the natural versus the unnatural. Sharp insightfully ties in Paul's discussions of homosexuality and polygamy with Greek discourses on the inversion of nature, which Sharp refers to as a discourse. He connects it with the discourse on prodigy, which is sort of a strange thing. And to get the exact thing of to get the exact idea of what we are meaning, I included this quote from 175. Languages do not function as a sign of judgment in Paul's letters, but there are many other things in the ancient world that could display God's displeasure. Discerning and interpreting these became particularly institutionalized in Roman divination, and its recording of prodigies, the use that we're talking about here, a prodigy was, according to Susan Satterfield, an aberration in what the Romans considered the natural order of things. A talking chicken, a hermaphrodite, a plague. The presence of a prodigy was either read as a warning of coming disaster or an expression of divine anger. Underlying both possibilities could be the assumption that a prodigy provided evidence that a god has removed him or her protection from the people. And we have an example of this here. So this is from Plutarch's Roman Questions. Hoto de kai ornis anthropo ila lesen, hos historiae kai anthropos ek gynaikos, kai andros hama egenethe, kai loimos egeneto semai tauta inomisan paraphysiae gegoninai. And when the bird spoke to man, as it is reported, and a human was born of both woman and man at once, and a plague occurred, these signs were considered to have happened against nature. Once prodigies were identified, they were then subject to interpretations, often by means of the Sibylline books. Oh, by the way, this is continuing the quote, but I threw that part in just to let you know the kind of differences. One particular example. So we see sins against nature, something against nature. Once prodigies were identified, they were then subjected to interpretation, often by means of the Sibylline books, and these interpretations would determine how to seek the pax deum, the peace of the god, restoring the right relationship with the gods, and averting disaster. Livy lists wars, this is again staying with Sharp. Livy lists wars, famine, and diseases as things people attribute to the wrath of the gods, and notes a number of occasions in which the Romans consulted the Sibylline books and offered expiations in response to such events. The cause of divine wrath was not always clear or indeed important. The main concern was how to now seek peace with the gods. When an explanation was offered, it usually related to some form of impiety in the form of ritual error or the transgression of divine norms, which threatened social or political cohesion. Paul often assumes the role, again quoting from Sharp, Paul often assumes the role of the discerner and interpreter of divine wrath in response to certain circumstances. He traces sickness and death amongst some of the Corinthians to improper conduct at the ritual meal, eating the bread and drinking the cup in an unworthy manner. He does this in 1 Corinthians, where is it? 11, 27 and 30. It could be argued that this is not a sign of judgment, but was in fact judgment itself. The way that Paul interprets these judgments, however, shows that there is more to it than that. Paul interprets the events as acts of divine discipline sent to the Corinthians to rectify their ways and avert a fuller final judgment, which he says in the 32nd verse of the 11th chapter. The immediate smaller scale judgments thus serve a communicative intent as they show up problems in the way Corinthians are currently acting and alert them to the need to change their actions and to avert further judgment. So with all of that in mind, I want us to go to one of Paul's most dramatic statements, and that is in Romans, the first chapter, 26 and 27. And this is particularly related to discourse about homosexuality. So understanding that seeing things as inversions also predict future harm, I think that this adds a certain valence on what this text means or could mean. So 26 and 27. For this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, pathe atimias. Their females exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the males, giving up natural intercourse with females. The King James, I think, says, forsaking the use of the woman, which I think is funny, were consumed with passionate desires, lusts for one another's. Males committed shameless acts with males and received their own persons the due penalty for their error. The pathe atimias, this passion of dishonor, signal not merely private transgressions, but the externalization of divine judgment upon a collective moral collapse. For Paul, moral failure does not originate in autonomous choice, divorced from theology, but is rather symptomatic of a ruptured relationship with God. Human morality, in his letters, is never neutral terrain, but the battleground of divine scrutiny. Hence, ethical conduct is not framed in aspirational or philosophical terms, but in starkly prescriptive categories. One either conforms to the order established by divine will, or you serve to become as evidence of its abandonment. This is precisely the rhetorical trajectory that we find here, where the decline from idolatry into dishonorable passions unfolds a forensic demonstration of divine wrath. Paul's syntax, he repeats this phrase, and God gave them over, foregrounds divine agency in response to human infidelity. Importantly, Paul abstains from moralizing individual behaviors in isolation, and he refracts them through the prison of communal degradation. I realize that's a lot of words right there, my apologies. His concern is not the inner psychology of those who commit acts against nature, but rather the revelation of a society alienated from its ideal type. These unnatural relations in his mind signify the visible scars of a theological disorder, not merely ethical missteps. They are signs that require divination, is my point. In this Pauline economy, behavior is not self-expressive. It is theophanic. The passions of dishonor do not simply arise, they are given over, permitted, and displayed as consequences primarily of theological deficit. Paul's anthropology is thus eschatological at heart. Ethical decline signals not simply broken morality, but the impending dissolution of covenantal coherence. Morality then becomes a sign of judgment, a visible corollary of invisible estrangement. And that was very, very heavy, I realize. But now we are in a different frame here. And I'm going to come back in, and then we will going to stop sharing, and then we're going to have a discussion, and it's going to start with this one. I hate coming to conclusions. I feel like a historian should never think that you understand something about the conclusions. So I share that belief. But what I do want to say about this is that when we think about issues related to uh, everything, the way that Paul is displaying his own interpretation of morals, I think that people very often get caught up in a very individualistic, modernist perspective about individual souls and individual punishment. And I think that what is very important to realize in Paul is that he is always looking for signs about the end of the age. He is an apocalypticist. He is not concerned solely with morality. And I mean, again, that's not exactly perfect because, I mean, I certainly don't want to have the weight of all the children of Israel placed upon one sin or several sins, but that's how he views things. That fundamentally the I, or the plural you, that he speaks with is much more about a community in the midst of a new paradigm shift. And breaking that paradigm shift foretells disaster. Now, I I moved away from this because I realized, one, I quoted from Sharp a lot. So, I mean, and I really hope that all of you at some point read his book. And I'm going to send everybody here what I took originally to be, next slide. Oh, yes. Um, what I took originally to be the end of what I wanted to say today, which was to read this quotation. And I realize now that we don't need to do that. And I just sent it to you. But so if you want to download that to your machines, everyone, this is the conclusion. And there is one particular phrase that Sharp uses that I think is sort of the it sort of clarifies everything I wanted to say, is that there is no particular difference in Paul's understanding between revelation and divination. And I think so Sharp says it something like this, and I don't remember the exact words. I think he says revelation and divination, two sides of the same coin. And I think that this is really, really important when we are looking at this discussion about who speaks for God and how. And that this divinatory element, that the fact is that God is not speaking, I mean, it's not something like we're back in the ancient Israel and we can hear God speak from heaven. No, no, no. It's always through various levels of mediation. And paying attention to those levels of mediation is really important because, well, for a variety of reasons, but the most general is that, at what point does one person's, well-meaning divination become torture, and what point does that weigh on someone else? And I think that this is why keeping these sorts of things in mind are so important when you're looking at Paul. Because as we talked again, Paul's interpretation of the Christian message was very pervasive to the point that many people cannot foresee or cannot see a version of Christianity without his interpretation. But we are fundamentally resisting this. And, or are we? I think is a good question for when we go to Swedenborg. I think we are, by the way. I think we are. But I'll let the cat out of the bag. Um, but what I'm interested to see is that in some way, what Swedenborg, and this is sort of the end of where I see all of this, is that Swedenborg repositions that arrangement. And he sort of becomes for us a new Paul. But instead of using the same kind of rhetorical strategies, Swedenborg is using something else, experience. And experience that is also not mediated, if you believe him, which I think is a very interesting point. So with that, let's start our discussion.